We never hear the words power and humility in the same sentence except when it means that they're the opposite of each other. We think that humble people are not powerful people, they're weaklings. And to be powerful means to never be humble or to show any kind of weakness or meekness. Now, Zechariah, a prophet, centuries before Christ, is given the gift to kind of foresee in a very general way a future way of dealing with world problems. This is not about temple worship and liturgy. This is about the political scene, the military scene. And he predicts to his fellow believers in Judaism what a future leader, a future king for them will be like if he's going to be successful. So watch the change there. He says this, "See, your king shall come to you, meek, riding on an ass, on a colt, the foal of an ass." Of course, this could be a prediction of the day Jesus, on Palm Sunday, rides into Jerusalem on a small borrowed donkey, Hosanna, Hosanna. Not a powerful guy, not some military messiah taking over the government. Meek, riding on the foal of an ass, could mean just in general the future kings of Israel. But this description would be pretty slim pickings for a traveler in even the ancient world. They didn't have Rolls Royces and stretch limousines, but if you were wealthy, if you are king or a monarch, you wouldn't be traveling on a vehicle called a burro. And then Zechariah adds, no horse, and then finally, he shall banish the chariot, which was one of the most speedy forms of travel, especially in a battle. The smallest and slowest means of transportation then would be in their time the mule, the foal of an ass. It's also the cheapest mode of transportation in the ancient world except for traveling on foot. And in the Gospels it's clear that Jesus, except for Palm Sunday, never takes anything except walking on feet. But there is more. The warrior's bow, Zechariah says, shall be banished. Now, how can a king administer his kingdom or empire without something like the military, without weapons and so forth, without war wagons or chariots? Just simple means suffice. And if he diminishes himself by being a low-key guy, will people interpret him as a very weak person? Let's attack him. But the message of Zechariah is clear that the use of force and coercion may look to some like power, but maybe in some cases it isn't power at all. It's a mistake. It can be very destructive. It can finally miss the goal of what it's for. Many times revolutionaries start some uprising and it gobbles them up. And so power in the physical sense can be very wrong when there are peaceful means, humble strategies that yield and produce results that are just as fair and honest and just. And that's hard to find throughout history, but it does work. And that's what we're being summoned to on this July 4th weekend. Now, last Sunday was June 28th. And for me, it's an important thing as I look at the history, not just of the USA or the world, but the church. What is the role of the church, God's kingdom, for these 2,000 years or 600 years before to Zechariah's time? God is at work. What's he trying to do? Stop all this carnage and so forth and violence. And it was 106 years ago on June 28th, the year was 1914, that a 19-year-old teenager in a town called Sarajevo took out a pistol and shot and killed the future emperor of Austria-Hungary and his wife as they rode past a coffee bar in an open touring car on a Sunday visit to one of the provinces. This assassination was the result of a terrorist plot, so it's got a political tragedy behind it. We won't go into all the details. It should not have triggered, though, the worst world war in history up to that time, just by that assassination, as bad as it was, which meant there were things building up for decades before among not just 19-year-old teenagers, but world leaders, and this is in Europe. We were not involved until the last year and a half of the First World War, so we had no real part in the formation, the buildup. The real culprits were the leaders of Europe at the time, kings, 2 emperors, prime ministers, presidents of states, who seemed to treasure military power, nationalism, false nationalism, jingoism, prestige, imperial pride, my country, right or wrong, over and above the use of looking at the big picture, using reason, diplomacy, may I add, a certain meekness, a certain humility that allows people to find other solutions than a military buildup. And it also involves a proper understanding of human rights. And you don't need the Bible to get to that, because yesterday, 244 years ago, in a building in Philadelphia, 56 founding fathers signed a document that told us that human rights can be discerned by the human mind through reasoning. There was a humility that pays attention to the deeper issues. Divine assistance is very important, and that's why Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams said, all men are endowed by the Creator with certain rights that cannot be taken away. That's the basis for diplomacy, settling disputes long before there's a recourse to battles and so forth. When peaceful means are available to settle disputes, they must be used. That's just the moral idea. Even the just war theory requires it, which is very ancient both before and after the Catholic Church. Recourse to physical force, violence, mob rule, they're bizarre events. They're violent events. Mob rule loses control. It swallows up its own leaders. And look what's happening now in a certain sense of racial outrage of what's happened the last month or so. They're tearing down of statues, really. What does that mean? Why not recourse to the proper legal system? In Richmond, they took down several statues. The mayor authorized one of them, and the outcry was that, well, you didn't ask the city council. Don't we have a representative assembly? Don't we have laws? Shouldn't we have been involved sensibly and quietly without some kind of knee-jerk? So, innocent lives can be lost in many outbreaks like that because people jump the gun, knee-jerk reactions. Now, you've heard this phrase before, I'm sure, many years ago, if you're in my age group. The phrase is peaceful non-violence, peaceful resistance. That was the philosophy and the political strategy of one of the greatest liberators in the 20th century. His name was Mohandas Gandhi, the Mahatma Gandhi, and he used peaceful nonviolence as a strategy to throw off the British Empire from India, one of their colony, but is part of their empire. There were more people in India than in Great Britain. And it was the same strategy later that Dr. Martin Luther King used in the mid-60s during the development of the civil rights movement, peaceful nonviolence. In the gospel today, Jesus, ironically, is proclaiming himself to be the ultimate reason, the icon, the starting point of why the virtues of meekness and humility can be winning strategies in many challenges today to peace and when relationships are going through a crisis. This does not apply in every world situation, so we're not going to blanket with some kind of false pacifism. But watch what Christ does in the Holy Week that we barely could celebrate with people, but every year, from Palm Sunday to Good Friday, the prophet Isaiah says, like a lamb before the slaughter, he opened not his mouth. When he was tormented and teased by enemies, when people lied about him to arrest and put him to death, he did not react with violence, with criticism, with curses and so forth, and all that. He just peacefully accepted it, later to overcome and be victorious over all his enemies. So God does have the last word. That's why we're religious people here. But Jesus, as we know, is not afraid of using force when no other solution will succeed. Sometimes push has to come to shove. And we see this especially in the dramatic purges. It's in several of the Gospels. In the temple courtyards, precincts, and vestibules, all surrounding the holiest place on earth, from the business kiosks and arcades and stuff like that. That was Jesus' intent to say that the temple is a house of prayer for all peoples. It's not a den of thieves or commercial activity. Even in Rome, the greatest church in the world, the biggest, St. Peter's, with its great square, the piazza, and the great colonnades and stuff, there's no commercial activity allowed inside that part of the Vatican City State. It's down the road in Rome where the souvenir hawkers are, medals, rosaries, and stuff. A distinction. Also, we see a dramatic event. We kind of hold our breath when, as Jesus is being arrested in the Garden of Olives, as Judas finishes the betrayal and gives him the kiss to mark him out for the arrest, Peter draws his sword. He attempts to stop the arrest of Jesus with a violent act, slicing off the ear of the high priest's steward, quite opposite of the quiet, peaceful demeanor of Jesus as he's hauled away. Jesus picks up and repairs the severed ear, but he teaches us this one sentence: those who live by the sword will perish by the sword. And he's implying there that we don't want to make the military-industrial complex the sole means to finding world peace, even though we may need to have recourse to it. I am concerned when I was watching the early news, sipping some coffee, that the scroll was saying that the Defense Department is sending 2 aircraft carriers of the United States Navy to the South China Sea. I wonder what's happening there. They ain't there to stop the COVID virus, I'm sure, but I'm worried because there's always this tinderbox going on. Recourse to arms and weapons. We know Communist China is a very aggressive dictatorship, like North Korea, its neighbor. We don't want them to gobble up the free world. Our nation is celebrating yesterday and this weekend its 244th birthday. It was founded, as I said, by 56 brave leaders who represent 13 separate colonies under British domination. The colonist leaders tried through negotiations to stop the abuses they opposed: taxation without representation, no real voice in the parliament, where laws are made and where diplomacy, humble meekness is there, backroom deals and stuff without going to war over something. But when the legal means failed, our first war, our Revolutionary War, was what secured our independence, not negotiations. There's many brave people parched us that. If they didn't win, we'd all be singing today, God Save the Queen, rather than God Bless America. We live in a world today that still struggles in many places to guarantee human rights to billions of people, as our founding fathers discerned, using their minds, their philosophy, and basing human rights that you don't have to use a weapon to, but sometimes you have to. Often it fails to try, the world does, the diplomatic approach, as in the First World War. Humility and understanding may not always succeed, but we must attempt it, and many times they do. Zechariah and Jesus today are teaching us that it is still possible for world leaders, through reason and understanding, to prevail in progress. Those people who are humble, I didn't say weak in terms of a stupid way, but humble in a willing way to diminish the people means they're not threatening people. When you don't threaten people, the other side might open up more. When they open up more, they're able to listen more clearly. That's very important. And there are many episodes in history where that's worked. The human tendency then to use force and coercion one day has to give way to allowing the direction to come also from God. Zechariah is not the only prophet who speaks of ways to peace. Christ does, and even St. Paul will speak to that. We'll hear that throughout the year in different places. But the direction of God has to be invited. I always smile in a very good way when I reread the brief Declaration of Independence as an annual ritual of mine. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That means they're not in the Bible. Well, of course they are, but you don't need that if they're self-evident. Inalienable rights. What are those rights? The 3 authors said: the right to life. You don't need to be a priest or a Catholic to know what the right to life means. It seems to be forgotten. The right to liberty and freedom in a fair, just way. Doesn't mean you tear down statues without respect to other issues. And the pursuit of happiness, a very vague statement, but we're in this world. It's not a hell, but we have to realize that we have to allow society to arrange that in just, peaceful means. Now, St. Paul is read today too. Very powerful phrase. Can't develop it this morning, but he says very simply to the Roman Christians, he's about to come there to be executed. They're afraid because they're being persecuted. He said, remember, you are not in the flesh. Well, of course they have human bodies, they're flesh and blood, but he uses the word flesh, being himself trained in Greek philosophy. He says, you're more than flesh and blood. You're more than a human brain. You're more than simply a normal Homo sapiens sapiens, flesh and blood, who can use your brain and reasoning powers. You're more than that. In baptism, you also have the power of God in you, the Spirit of God, as a source of information and a source of appealing to solutions that might use the powerful weapons of meekness and humility. On the contrary, Paul says, you are in the Spirit. He's talking to us today. He's talking to world leaders. He's talking to our Congress and others. And he wants us to know this will happen if only the Spirit dwells in you. And that can't happen unless we allow it. So we thank God on this July 4th week for the gift of this democracy, 244 difficult years. Remember, the worst war in the U.S. history, in which the most carnage and loss of life, both innocent and military, was not the Second World War or Vietnam or the First. It was the U.S. Civil War between the states, a domestic problem over a deep moral issue. Are all men created equal? Are all women concluded in that? And so on. So the opening prayer would say, we acknowledge with gratitude the gift, O Lord, of freedom, religious freedom. We also ask you to help us in the years to come as we struggle to face what this all means.